Hello again, it's your old Uncle Jeff with another vlog about the family. This starts in 1978. Mom was now back from her trip to Arizona with Florence Dirks and making plans. And before she left, she said, well, I think I'm going to get the house ready and put it on the market. Randy and I were still living in the condo, but I had my contract for my first job as a doctor at South Medical in Minneapolis with a big salary of $29,000 a year. But we were able to qualify to build our own house. We found a lot, a builder. He had some plans. I modified them. Our condo had doubled in price over 3 years from $22,000 to $44,000, so we had a nice down payment. And so we went ahead to build our house because Mom said, you have to take the dining room set and some of the big furniture, and some of the smaller stuff will go to Judy's house. So we had that actually already started in the summer of '78. She and Mike started dating a little more openly then. In fact, she confided in me that they were having an intimate relationship, and she of course felt guilty about that because she was going to become a Catholic, and she knew any religion frowned upon any couple having fun outside of marriage. And I said, at your age, just have fun, and I'm glad you've got a younger man that can make you happy. So she felt bitter about that. So then it was time to get ready to go to Arizona, and of course they couldn't stay together in the same mobile home. So she found one that she could rent for Mike to stay in about a block away, and then so they both went down and went to their separate homes and continued seeing each other. And she introduced Mike to all her and Pete's friends, and they all liked him, and he was an easy study for teaching new things. They taught him how to play bridge, and then they eventually went to duplicate bridge, and they became master point champions of duplicate bridge. Mike had been quite an athlete in baseball, I guess in football too, in his younger days, but he never had played golf. And so he learned golf and became good at that, and he and Mom won little trophies playing golf. And so they had quite a life down there. So by the time the winter of '79 was coming to the end, they decided they wanted to get married. They had already consulted the Catholic Church about Mom becoming Catholic. It was so important to Mike, and so she decided to do it. Religion wasn't really an important thing to her. She was raised in a non-church going family, and she and Lloyd didn't go to church. Judy actually went to the Methodist church when she was 8 and asked to be baptized, and so Mom and Lloyd had to go down and authorize that, but they still never went to church. Judy went on her own, and she even had to urge them to get me baptized when I was about 2 in 1951, as I recall it was. So when she married Pete, of course, she became a Lutheran, which is probably the most benign religion there is, and now she was going to the most rule-infected religion there is, a Catholic Church, and so she knew what was ahead. They decided finally that they would just go and get married at the courthouse before they came back to Minnesota because they wanted to live together, and it made sense, and so they did that. And they came back to Olivia, and then they started the process of Mom becoming a Catholic, taking all the courses. But in order to go to church so that Mike could have communion, they had to confess once a week to the priest that they were having unlawful, horrible, outside of the church sex. And then he could take communion. Mom couldn't because she wasn't a church member yet. So they found a workaround. The Catholic Church no longer made it a horrible mortal sin to not go to church on Sunday. Apparently in the old days, you could go to church 6 days a week, but if you didn't go on the seventh day, Sunday, you committed a mortal sin and you were condemned to hell and damnation for the rest of your life. I don't think many Catholics believe that, and Mom certainly didn't. So they found out they could Saturday afternoon and then go to church Saturday night, and Mike could get communion, and then they could sin for the rest of the week until the next Saturday, and then do the thing all over again. And she'd call up and complain that they had to, say these things to the priest. And I said, well, that's the religion full of a bunch of dogmatic rules, and you've made the choice and you're doing it for him. So I said, that's really great of you, and stick to it. So she did. Then they ran into another roadblock. She was divorced from that first marriage, and the Catholic Church does not allow divorce. You can't, and so but Lloyd had affairs, so maybe we can get it annulled. So they applied for an annulment, documenting the 1945 and 1955 affair that Lloyd had. The last one he got married to Verna. Sent it off to Rome, came back, stamped, denied. It wasn't enough infidelity for the Catholic Church to annul that marriage. He had to have been unfaithful during the majority of the marriage. So Mike got a hold of Lloyd's contact info from Judy, either called him or wrote him and said, please, would you write a letter saying that you were more unfaithful than what was documented? And he said, well, that's not true. He said, I'm embarrassed to say, but I did have that affair. And then, later on, it is what it is. Verna and I needed to be together. And I'm not proud of what I did, but that's what happened. And Mike said, oh, please, I'll give you $1,000. And it's so important to me that Martha become a Catholic. And this is the rule. This is what they're telling us you have to do. So we never did find out the exact details of if money exchanged hands or if Lloyd just capitulated, because they were good friends from Olivia. So he got a letter that Lloyd said that he had lust in his heart for many women, and that he had been unfaithful throughout most of the marriage. And apparently the Pope took that as gospel truth. So this kind of points out the hypocrisy of most strongly dogmatic churches, that you have to lie to be able to justify some of their goofy rules, which were made by old men years ago to control people's behavior. None of this came from God, but they got it through, and they were able to get married in the church in 1981, I believe it was. In late 79 late 79, they both sold their houses in Olivia, and Judy and I went out with a U-Haul, and we brought back the furniture that I was going to have, and then she took some of it too. And so, they were down in Arizona for good. They then started doing summers in California. They would rent different condos in La Jolla, and eventually they started going to a Mormon college campus in Rexburg, Idaho, where they had housing for married students. In the summer it was open, but the college still had courses going on and entertainment and different shows they put on, and so retired people lived in this housing for 3 months, and it was very inexpensive, something like $900 for the whole summer, which included an evening meal in the cafeteria, so it was a good deal. Shortly after this marriage, Mom had another betrayal, this time by Mike, believe it or not. In about 1982, his oldest daughter, Nancy, who was a nurse, the younger daughter, Jeannie, was in my class, and she was also a nurse. Nancy was going to get remarried. Now, here we are. Good Catholic had married her high school boyfriend, Dick Thaler, and shortly after marriage, he came down with MS. And Nancy, being an astute nurse, knew what was ahead of her for this married life. She didn't want to take care of a sick husband, and she divorced him, which of course goes totally against all the rules of every church and every marriage, till death do you part. But anyway, she did that. So I'm not sure how this marriage is going to take place, because I don't think she could have it in the Catholic Church. But anyway, she's going to get married. And so Mom and Mike bought tickets to come up. It was in the summer of '82, and in the spring, Nancy started putting the screws to Mike, saying, well, you're not bringing that woman to my wedding. I'm not sure what the deal was, but Nancy was a very controlling woman, much like her mother had been. And now she decided Mike was going to be the object of her control. And of course, this really bristled the hairs on Mom's neck, because she was a warrior type and used to being in control with her men. So a battle ensued that poor Mike didn't know what to do about. All he could do was flee. So she came home one day and he was gone, just like Lloyd. He had taken the car and his clothes and gotten an apartment in downtown Mesa and moved out. And she called him up and he said, well, Nancy, Nancy just says I have to do this. And Mom, called me up and she was all upset. And I said, well, I guess you'll have to work it out. Why don't you enlist all your friends and the priest? Because, you're in the right on this, and they can pull up all the stuff about marriage and the wife comes first, and I'm sure all the Catholic dogma will work to your favor in this. So she did that. She was smart, and they came down on him, like Russia bombing Ukraine, which is going on right now. And still it didn't move him. Well, she decided that when the time came for them to go to Minnesota, she wasn't going to stay in Arizona and admit defeat. She was going to come up and stay with Randy and me in our house. And so there. So she and Mike rode up on the plane, I guess in silence. And I went to the airport and picked her up, and Mike had scooted off somewhere so he didn't see me because I didn't run into him. She came and stayed with us. At this time, Randy was working for the Kidney Center in downtown Minneapolis, and I was at South Medical, so we would leave during the day, but we had a third car, a Jeep, and that I used in the winter, to go in to deliver babies and just to have fun. And it was a stick shift, but, she knew how to drive that. They took her out, and she, learned how to do it again, made sure she was comfortable. So then she drove the Jeep over to Judy's to see Judy and the grandkids that were still in White Bear. So after the wedding was over, then it was time to go back. So I take her to the airport, and she meets up with Mike. I don't think I saw him then either. And they rode back in the plane together, but now he was relieved because Nancy now had a new husband to control. And she sort of let up on Mike because, the big brouhaha was over. She didn't want Mom at the wedding. Well, she got her way for that. So they started talking, and, they got there, and they went their separate ways. She went back to the house that they now had in Leisure World. They weren't in Apache Wells anymore. Mom had a fear of fire, and when she saw what happened to a manufactured home when it went up in flames in Apache Wells, one time that happened, she decided that she would build a house out of Arizona slump block, which is the kind of brick they have down there, which was fireproof. So she went back to Leisure World. Mike went back to his apartment, and she just let him sit there and think about it. And of course, he was lonely, and Nancy wasn't bugging him anymore, and his friends were, not refusing to play golf with him and isolating him. And it's interesting because it's very similar to what all the countries are doing to Putin now that he invaded Ukraine this week. And eventually he came back with his hat in hand and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, will you forgive me?" And she said, "Yeah, of course." And in the meantime, her friend had taken her to the Chevy dealer, and she'd bought a new Chevy Caprice because she needed a car. So now they had two cars. Well, they came back home and had the two cars for a while. Once they figured out it was going to work, Mike sold his car, and they just kept the one car. So that drama was over. Then had a very nice life. She had introduced him to all kinds of new things. He had not traveled very much. He'd gone up to Canada on fishing trips and maybe to the adjacent states. And then he was stationed in Newfoundland during World War II, which is like, Minnesota on an island. So he didn't have much worldly experience. So Mom took him on a Caribbean cruise, and then they did a huge trip through Asia, Japan, China, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Hong Kong. And so he got his eyes open to all that. In fact, they were planning a trip through Europe, too, when life intervened again. So, they really had a good life and enjoyed all their friends. Mike had learned how to cook, since Hannah hadn't been able to cook the last few years of her life. So they cooked together, and Randy and I would go out to their house for Sunday dinners. We'd have them to our house, and it was very nice. About 1985, Now, we had moved to Arizona in 1984, so it's just a year later. Mom needed to have a hip replacement, and after she had that, she got a little confused. She kept telling the nurse her son was coming to take her home, and it was just the afternoon of the surgery. But that finally cleared up, and she did well with it. Then in 1986, she slipped in some water on the sidewalk and broke her other hip, and she didn't need it replaced, but she had to have a plate put in. And that anesthesia made her a little goofy for a few days, but eventually, it did clear up. By about 1987, we noticed her short-term memory was going, that she would repeat things, and then she was starting to do goofy things like get up in the early morning and go wander in the neighborhood just in her underwear and a t-shirt, bang on the neighbors' doors and say, "Help, my husband's trying to kill me," which just mortified Mike because he said, I would never do anything like that to your mother. And I said, I know, she's obviously getting Alzheimer's. So he had to buy thumb locks that you put in the channels that turn tight of the sliding doors, and actually put a hasp and a padlock on the inside of the double front doors to keep her from escaping. And as clever as she was, she would take her cane and sit and hit that thumb screw on the sliding door until she got it loose and would get out. So he had to really keep track of her during this time. Then she started having trouble walking, and she wasn't able to get up off the couch. Well, her lumbar spine was starting to collapse on itself, and this is the bane of the Wingates. A lot of spinal problems in that family. In fact, cousins Bonnie and Dick both had spinal problems all their life. Bonnie got rods in her back when she was 47, and Dick had back surgery when he was young, and they all just, now Bonnie is 75 and actually bedbound with her back problems. So Mom was starting to have that, so she had her first laminectomy, and that cured things, but she got a little more goofy after the anesthesia. So I said to Mike, you just tell me she's got the money from her investments that she would be able to afford a nursing home. Whenever you can't take care of her anymore, just let me know. We'll do that. Well, no, he says, long as she's continent, or actually then she got to the point where he couldn't trust her with pee. So she wore adult pull-up diapers, and that worked okay. But he said, well, if it gets worse, if she starts having trouble with poo, then, maybe we'll have to think about it. Well, by about 1991, she was sometimes not able to make it to the bathroom for bowel movements. And then she also started playing with her stool, wrapping it up in toilet paper and hiding it around the house. And I had to laugh at this because she was such a bowel-fixated, fastidious woman all of her life. I remember when we would go on trips, we couldn't get in the car and go until she'd had her morning BM. And boy, if it didn't happen, she'd be using glycerin suppositories. And I'd say to Dad, well, I think she just poops out the suppository and then thinks she's done. Anyway, that's what happened. So in 1991, I looked at nearby nursing homes, and there was a wonderful one named Hearthstone that was just about a half mile from where they lived, and so it was convenient for Mike because he wanted to go over and help her out at meal times. So she entered Hearthstone, and she was probably moving into the second stage of Alzheimer's by then. And shortly after being admitted there, the other side of her lumbar spine started collapsing, and she started losing the ability to walk, and she had to have the second laminectomy, and then that anesthesia really catapulted her further into deeper second stage Alzheimer's, where she was starting to, forget who we were, although she always remembered Mike. I remember Randy and I would go out there during this time, and we would test her, and I'd say, Mom, who's that? And I'd point to him, and she'd say, oh, you know who he is. He's that guy. And I said, well, what's his name? She'd say, that's Randy. And then Randy would do the same thing, who's that guy? And she'd look at me and she'd say, well, oh, you know that guy. And he'd say, well, what's his name? And she'd look at me and she'd say, Kipper. So she named me my dog's name and still remembered Brandy longer than she remembered my name, although she always smiled and beamed when she saw us. In fact, she'd sometimes break into tears out of emotions. So After the next laminectomy, the physical therapists at the home were trying to teach her how to walk again, and they'd say, Martha, put your foot in front of the other one, and she couldn't even follow that direction. So they finally gave up and said she's just going to be chair bound now the rest of her life. And Mike didn't accept that. He went up there every day for lunch and supper, and then he took a little nap at home in between. But after that surgery, when they gave up on her therapy, he took her out of the unit into the hall where the railing was and had her hang on, and he walked her up and down that hall for weeks and months, and she finally got back to walking, and she remained mobile until she got into the third stage of Alzheimer's, which was probably within just the last 6 to 8 months of her life. So kudos to Mike, a feather in his cap for persistence and keeping our mother going. Judy and I often would refer to Mike as Saint Michael because he really took good care of her. And of course, he'd had good training with Hannah because he had to take over running the whole house, when her schizophrenia got bad. And of course, that was a different kind of craziness than what Mom was doing. But he was a well-trained caregiver by that time. He dutifully noted all of her birthdays and took pictures for us, and you could see her deteriorating finally when he took the last picture March 3rd, 1995, just a month before she died. She was sort of hanging onto the table, and it just looked like the old adage that the lights are on and no one's home. I think probably her soul was visiting the astral plane a lot and not even in her body, because she would react to Mike, but she had no reaction to me anymore or even Randy. So, and then the week of Good Friday, which was about a month later, Mike called and said, Mother is refusing to eat. We put the food in her mouth and the water, and she just goes blah, 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 and pushes it out. And then I said, well, there's a stage in Alzheimer's where you forget how to eat or forget how to swallow. And I said, this is the way a person with Alzheimer's usually dies, is they just don't eat anymore. And indeed, that was a Tuesday, and I said, she's probably only going to be around a few more days. And on that Friday, which was Good Friday, 1996, she passed away. So she had a great life with Michael, and he certainly took care of her in payback of that karma for that little betrayal back in 1992. She had wisely created a living estate for him so he could stay in the house as long as he wanted to, and I believe he stayed there till about 2002, and he started getting some memory problems. So Nancy and Jeannie were in contact with me, and they came down and they finally moved him back to Olivia, to an assisted care, and then he went into a one-step higher care home, and then eventually they moved him down to Minnetonka in a memory care unit, and I believe he lived until 2007. So they took good care of him at the end. So that was Mom's third marriage, and I guess the third time was the charm for her. My next vlog is going to be about some of the psychic experiences I've had in my life and how my philosophy changed from being not much of a religious or churchy person into a spiritual one. And as I did that, many fantastic things have happened to me in my life. More later.